Welcome to my review for Last Night in Soho, which I saw a week ago now. I've had a whole week to sit on this one and digest it. Now, a quick confession before we get into it. I have never seen an Edgar Wright movie before. I've often heard that he's awesome. I've just never seen any of his stuff. He's not done that many movies, to be fair. Somebody bought me for my 24th, 25th birthday a copy of Shaun of the Dead on the basis that I really love zombie movies, which I do. But I don't really like comedy films, so that film wasn't really for me. I watched about 10 minutes of it and then I just had to turn it off. I've heard that Baby Driver's a good film, never seen it. And there was this whole thing years ago when Ant-Man was in production. Edgar Wright was going to direct that. And then he either took himself off the project or the studio released him. But there was this whole thing online that people were not going to watch it anymore because Edgar Wright was no longer doing it. I remember thinking to myself, really? You would not watch the movie for that reason? And I think Ant-Man actually turned out pretty good in the end from what I can remember. So this was definitely Mr. Wright's big chance to impress me, because I certainly wasn't going to turn this film off after 10 minutes when I'd paid for my cinema ticket. I probably couldn't turn it off anyway with it being at the cinema, or I'd get arrested. And the cards were stacked in his favour for this. I mean, this is a horror film. I love horror. This is a sort of half supernatural, half giallo film. I like both of those subgenres. So, yeah, this was his chance. The story is about a girl who lives in Cornwall, but she leaves there to go to university in London to start a fashion course. But at night times, she starts to have what can only be described as these astral projection experiences, where she's thrust into the body of a girl called Sandy in the 1960s. Our protagonist is called Eloise, and through Sandy, Eloise starts to experience the nightlife of the 60s, which at first is all fun and games because Eloise just happens to really like 60s music. She's got all these vinyl records and things. But the more she does this night after night, Sandy's life in the 60s starts to take a bit of a sinister turn, and Eloise suspects that eventually something really bad is going to happen to her. And if this wasn't bad enough, in the present day, during the daytime, Eloise is starting to experience these ghostly apparitions as well. So it's all going wrong. And as somebody who has experienced the university life myself, it's a hard enough existence anyway without this kind of shit happening. So if we start off with my positives for this film, the whole thing has a really bubbly musical vibe. I mean, it's almost half musical, half horror film at times. There are so many songs in this that you will have heard of before, but you just can't quite remember the names of because they're so old, because they're songs from the 1960s. After about 20 minutes of the film, honestly, I almost felt like just getting up and having a bop and not watching the film anymore. If they'd have just shut the film down, turned on the cinema lights, and the cinema staff had brought some refreshments out and said, no, we're not watching this, we're going to have a party instead, I would have been absolutely fine with that, because that's the sort of mood that this film got me into. I don't think I've heard this much music in a film since Suicide Squad, the crap one, but it's more justified in this than in Suicide Squad. The main story is very original as well. There were a couple of times during the quieter moments where I tried to think to myself, is this film a riff on anything I've seen before? And I couldn't think of anything, so that's definitely something in the film's favour. I did not guess the twist at the end either, which I'm not going to reveal today. The main performances are all excellent, all throughout the cast. The main girl, Eloise, is played by Thomasin McKenzie. I've never heard of her before, but then again, she is only 21. I have heard of Anna Taylor-Joy, who plays Sandy. She's a little bit older than Thomasin McKenzie. She is absolutely superb in this. She's got a very physical role, lots of singing, dancing and moving, and she really pulls it off. And to my surprise, the main villain in this is played by the same guy who was apparently Doctor Who for a while. Now, I did not realise this until after the film and I looked at the cast list, but in my defence, I do not watch Doctor Who. And someone else I did not recognise during the film was Terence Stamp, General Zod himself from Superman 2. He's 80 odd years old now. I've probably not seen him in any film since the 90s, maybe Young Guns or The Real McCoy, but I'm still cross with myself for not recognising him until again I looked at the cast list afterwards. But the standout in this film, more than any of those great actors I've just talked about, is a girl whose name I can't remember, but she plays a character called Jacosta, I can't even get that right, but she's basically Eloise's roommate at university. She's like a British version of the Queen Bee from Mean Girls, except funnier. I mean, her dialogue in this is so sharp, and the people watching the film with me in the cinema just in stitches at some of the lines this girl was coming out with, especially in the first half of the movie. But every time she turns up after that, I was just thinking to myself in my head, come on, give us a couple more lines of really funny snark. Almost steals the movie, I'd say. She's not quite in it enough to be the absolute standout of the film. I would give that to Anna Taylor-Joy probably, but what a brilliant part. My final positives today are probably the very opening to the film and the very end. This film starts off well, finishes well. We get a sort of Skyfall type opening with the protagonist coming out of the shadows, and there's like a silhouette, and the minute of film that follows after that as Eloise bounces into a bedroom, it's a really cracking opening. It really puts you into the mood for the film. It sort of reminded me of the film Little Voice with Jane Horrocks, and at the end we actually get an epilogue to this. We so often don't in movies. You know, you'll have the final skirmish, you'll either get the happy ending or the unhappy ending. There's blood all over the place. Then we cut to credits. You know, we don't see the aftermath of the situation a few days later or a few months later. In this film we do, and I was very pleased about that. So now for my negatives. Unfortunately, this film cannot just sprint to the finish line and claim a gold medal. It does stumble several times, especially in the second half. Now, what I will say is, a lot of the things I'm about to talk about probably won't bug everybody, but they certainly bugged me. So there's this really annoying trope in this film. What will happen is, and this is usually in supernatural films, a character, probably the main character, will fall asleep and have a nightmare, or they'll just start daydreaming and have some kind of really nightmarish hallucination or something, and then they'll suddenly wake up with a start and scream. And because they're in a crowded place like a classroom or a workplace, they'll feel really embarrassed, they'll have all these sets of eyes on them, and then just to make it worse, they'll run out of the room. Now, I hate it when writers make characters run out of the room in this situation. You see it so many times. If it was real life and that happened to me, I wouldn't run out of the room. I'd just make some really pathetic joke like, oh, I was having a bit of a nightmare about my tax returns coming back early, nothing to see here. I mean, it would be a crap joke, no one would laugh, and I'd still feel embarrassed, but by running out of the room, you're making it worse, because then you have to potentially come back the following day or the following week, and I just think that would be so much harder. Now, if that situation had only happened once in this film, fine, I probably wouldn't give it that much thought, but honestly, it happens about 4 times in the space of 20 minutes in the second half, to the point where Eloise is just getting on my nerves by the fact that she just keeps running out of places. It's just cringeworthy. By the final time that it happens in a pub, it was getting me really annoyed, and I felt myself coming out of the movie. There are ways that you can make a character appear to be scared witless without having to make her embarrass herself in front of the whole world. I just really didn't like it in this film. Another thing that happens is that it's mainly Eloise again. She has a habit of almost getting run over in this film. Now, if you're being chased by a serial killer like Michael Myers, I could understand why you might come out into a road and get knocked over or almost knocked over. But when you're just having a conversation with somebody and you're walking along, you step out into a road, it's just really annoying when somebody just almost gets run over. It just wouldn't happen like that in real life. London is not Death Race 2000. Yes, it's a busy city for traffic, but a lot of it's slow moving. And I'm quite certain that if vehicles saw somebody standing in the middle of a road having a conversation, they wouldn't just drive at 60 miles an hour all the way up to that person, then suddenly screech to a halt so there can be a big jump scare. They just slow down gradually and then beep their horn. Again, if it just happened once in this film, I probably wouldn't have even noticed it. It would have been a very subliminal thing. But by the second time it happened, a car just screeching to a halt in front of Eloise and, oh, big scare, I was thinking, I'm just not buying this. And then just to make it worse, later in the film, a character actually gets run over. Again, a very silly situation where they're just having a conversation, walking across the road, and then suddenly, boof, car comes out of nowhere, seemingly with a driver in it that does not have the ability to spot somebody 50 yards in front of them. it's just silly, and especially in this situation, there's no reason why this character couldn't have just walked off, not died. It would not have affected the rest of the movie. My third and final complaint, and this is the thing that bothers me the least, but when I'm doing negatives, I'll always start off with the things that bothered me the most. So when I was walking home from the cinema and I started to think about the story, without giving anything away, there's something in the 1960s that a certain person has to keep doing again and again, and they get away with it again and again. And I just thought to myself, I'm just not buying that they would have been able to get away with that. Even with the police having much less technology back in those days, you just wouldn't have been able to get away with that. I mean, if you look at serial killers and how they've always been caught throughout the decades and stuff, the really famous killers, they don't get away with that stuff. You know, eventually they do get found out, they do get dragged away and put in prison. So I had a little bit of trouble with that, but yeah, like I said, there are a few things that bug me in the second half of this film. It is mainly just these habits that the writers go into of putting silly tropes in there, and like I said, Eloise almost getting knocked over, things like that. So to give you a conclusion about this one, I had a good time with it. I don't regret going to watch it. I think some of the writing is a little bit sloppy, especially in the second half of the film. Just these little minor things that could have been ironed out and the film would have been so much better. But it's a very nicely directed film. There's lots of scenes which are just set up in a really cool way, and I can see that there's some really creative flourishes in the way that Edgar Wright has filmed this and that. It's a gorgeous looking film. Musically, it's a great film. There are some good horror moments, some good scares. It's just a shame the movie couldn't have been touched up a little bit here and there to make it a really great film. I don't think this is one that I'm going to end up owning, but I can imagine that it will be a popular one because I don't think everybody's going to be bugged by the same small things that bug me. So I'm still positive on the whole, albeit with caveats. So let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give Last Night in Soho. We got 1, 2, 3 bloody axes out of 5. That is a good score, better than average. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend you giving this film a try if you can manage to go and see it before they take it out of the cinemas. Until next time, cheerio.